So today, what we're here to talk about, as I suggested last time, is poetry, biblical poetry, um, which of course Psalms is universally, uh, and it's not always obvious. So basic definitions like what is poetry, and honestly, at a certain point, I don't know. Uh, you pick up the New Yorker and you see what like the newest, latest poems look like. There's no rhyme and there's no meter. And like the only way that I could tell poems from straight prose is the typesetting, really, which is my cue to share my screen with you. Here it comes. Right. So there's no rhyme, there's no meter. Like you're right. It's the typesetting that like lets me know it's prose. It's got lines. It's like lineated, which I will say is kind of true of the Bible also, where there is also really neither rhyme nor meter. Um, Now, when you pick up your Bible, the Psalms are all set in your text as poetry in like poetic lines, which is how you know they're poetry, right? It's not continuous text like prose. It's like line by line, just like poetry should be. But occasionally, I will point out your Bibles will set off lines like that occur in otherwise sort of prose sections of the text. I will say like my Bible certainly does that. Here's an example. This is Genesis 15:15. This is God blessing Abraham. As for you, you shall go to your fathers in peace. You shall be buried at a ripe old age. So that's set off exactly as I've given it to you here in sort of poetic lines, or a chapter later. Here's another one. The angel of Yahweh said to her, that her here is Hagar, said to her further, behold, you are with child and shall bear a son. You shall call him Ishmael, for Yahweh has paid heed to your suffering. It doesn't really work. It's like I can't dance to it. But it's also set off as poetry. And maybe you can see why there's like a little bit of, actually this one's a little bit hard for me. But you get to something in Genesis 1 like this, and God created man in his image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. And my Bible does not set that off as poetry, but you definitely could. It would just look like this. And I don't see that that's really substantially different from what we had in Genesis 15 and 16. Now, um, we should remember that with only a very few exceptions, these like typeset markers of poetry are modern inventions. Right? And they differ from editor to editor and Bible to Bible. If you were to look at the JPS, some stuff would be set off as poetry that might not be in the NRSV or the NIV or the King James, whatever. So, I just showed you a couple of examples from Genesis 15 and 16, where my Bible, which I think is probably the JPS Bible, lineates it as poetry. But in a Torah scroll, like you'd find in a synagogue, the only text that is set off that way as poetry is the Song of the Sea, right, in Exodus 15. It looks like this. It's extraordinarily beautiful, I think. But this is the only part of the entire Torah that is set off this way. Otherwise, it just looks like what it looks like at the top and the bottom of the page there. Okay, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, this is the Psalms scroll from the Dead Sea Scrolls, and there's no poetic lines. It's written as if it's prose, just continuous lines going across there. There's also a very pretty scroll, that one. Even in as you all may know, if you've been with me long enough, right? Like every modern Bible translation of the Hebrew Bible is based off of the Leningrad Codex, which is our oldest, most complete text in Hebrew, which we should note is only 1,000 years old. The Leningrad Codex, which is from the 11th century CE, even there, poetic lines aren't really marked off. Here again is Psalms, and the verses are sort of separated by the spaces there, but it's not set up in what we would recognize as sort of like poetic lines. Uh, Sometimes I would say if we didn't know that we were reading poetry, we might not think we were reading poetry. So, this is obviously poetry. Uh, My God, I cry by day, you answer not, by night, and have no respite, right? Even though I've put it here in like prose format, it's obviously poetry. This, is poetry because this is like one of the more famous poems in the entire Bible, Psalm 23. Though I walk through the valley of deepest darkness, in the JPS translation, you know it as I walk through the valley of the shadow of death. I fear no harm, for you are with me. You know that's poetry. It's in the Psalms. But if you didn't know it was poetry, it looks pretty prosy. Um, Okay, so I guess my point in this like little introductory speech I'm giving is that in defining what is and isn't poetry, uh, we're sort of always working with aesthetic decisions, and those decisions are largely ours as modern readers, because of course we don't know how like the original authors would have set out their text or what they intended. Um, but there's some elements of biblical poetry that are worth knowing about, not because they are like the definition of poetry, but because they are really common. And the most important of these by far is what we call parallelism, which is what I'm going to spend most of today talking about. And I will start by telling you right now that parallelism is far, far richer in the original Hebrew. I mentioned that at the end of the last class. And you might say to me, well, that doesn't do me very much good. I don't know Hebrew. But there's plenty that we can see even without going back to the Hebrew. And later on, I'll bring some Hebrew in. But here is Psalm 24. You can't, again, I'm not giving you the Hebrew here, but you can see these two lines: the earth is the Lord's and all that it holds, the world and its inhabitants. There's like a parallel structure. There are parallel terms: earth and world, all that it holds, its inhabitants. They mean basically the same thing, but there's also, they're not identical. There's difference and variation. The next line in that psalm: for he founded it upon the ocean, set it on the nether streams. Again, you can see that the two things have a lot of commonalities, but also aren't exactly the same. Obviously, if they were exactly the same, it would just say the same thing twice. Or the next verse: who may ascend the mountain of Yahweh? Who may stand in his holy place? Again, like you can see the poetic. This should feel like like psalms, like hymns that we might recite in synagogue or church. This is like what Hebrew poetry looks like at its easiest. And the study of that poetry on like poetic grounds consists of exploring first and foremost the relationship between the two lines that make up the poetic unit. So in biblical poetry, the poetic unit is this, just what we've been showing you these last few slides, these two lines that often say much the same thing or are related somehow. And the question that we ask as we read is, okay, how do these two lines intersect and interact? How do they play off one another? And then once you figure that out, then you can say like, okay, well, how does this line play off against a different line in the same in the poem? So the key to understanding biblical poetic parallelism, which is what we're going to do for our time together here, is really it's to find the beauty in it. It's really easy to read stuff like this, and just be like, oh, so biblical poetry is just repetitive. Right, and it is. It's repetitive, but it's repetitive with a purpose. And this is where sort of the art of the psalm, where the art of biblical poetry lies. Both the art of its creation, whoever it is that wrote this, but also the art of its interpretation. Right? We have to get into the world of biblical poetry. We can't look at this from our contemporary standards and judge it by those. Although, as I sort of suggested at the beginning, as far as I can tell, there are no standards of what counts as poetry these days anymore. Okay, so that was my introduction, and really what I want to do for the next however long we have, 30 minutes or so, is I want to look at some examples of parallelism. Basically, I want to show you how I read biblical poetry. And obviously, Psalms are the largest collection of that poetry that we have. I'm going to do it in English, but there's going to be some Hebrew in there too, in transliteration, so that you can at least sort of pronounce it if you can't read the script. Anyway, I promise I'll be gentle about the whole thing. So before I get into any actual poetry, I want to lay out sort of the basics of how parallelism operates. Um, so you've got again 2 lines, right? The basic unit again is the 2-line couplet, which means that there's an A line and a B line, and those can be related in a whole variety of ways. A word in line A can be related to a word in line B, or the entirety of line A can be related to the entirety of line B. Okay, related how? Along these 3 potential axes that are on the screen. That is grammatically or syntactically, lexically or semantically, and phonologically. Which is to say, how do the lines say what they say? What do the lines say? And what do they sound like? And I'm about to show you examples of all of this. So I don't need all the confused looks I'm getting right now. I can't see any of you. As we enter in, we want to remember a couple of big picture things. First of all, when we say parallelism, I don't mean like parallelism can be expressed as like, oh, it's saying it's like it's echoing, it's doing the same thing, or it can be like, oh, it's doing the opposite thing, or it can be, oh, it's a development of, right? Parallelism, we think parallel and we think like the same, but parallelism just means these 2 lines are related and their task is to work out that relationship, and it can manifest in like it'd be synonymous or antinomous, the other opposite of synonymous, or it can be something totally else. It's even if the 2 lines say completely opposite things, it's still parallelism, right? Because we're still reading the 2 together. And the other big picture thing is, one of the ways to think about these lines sort of across biblical poetry, and this is something that was explained to all of us in the biblical world by my former teacher, James Kugel, was a way to think about these things is it's line A, and what's more, line B. So it's like it's a thought and then sort of a furthering of that thought. And that furthering, again, can take all kinds of shapes. So let's take a look. I will, is it like my 5th preface now? I love this stuff. Like, there was a time in my life when I taught an entire semester of just how to read biblical poetry. And I think it's so wonderful. And my hope is that over the course of me talking through it, you'll find it wonderful as well. And even figure out how to do it maybe in English, though it sure is easier with Hebrew. Okay, here's our first example. This is Psalm 103. Now, before we begin, 7th preface, just so you know, these translations probably won't look like your translations in your Bibles, because I'm trying to arrange the word order in English to mimic the Hebrew word order as much as possible, so that I can approximate sort of what the Hebrew looks like. And I'm going to be putting the Hebrew in between the lines like this. Anyway, so keeping the word order in English makes my life easier, because then I can just have them, you can see where every word lines up. So what do we see here? And we can just look at the English for a second. Not according to our sins has he dealt with us, and not according to our iniquities has he requited us. Okay, so even in English, this parallelism is, pretty identical. These 2 lines clearly seem to be very, very similar. So how do we talk about this? Okay, so we can start with sort of the grammatical and syntactical issues. Both of these lines have exactly the same grammatical and syntactical structure. The words are in the same order. The verbs conjugations are the same. The only difference grammatically is the "and" at the beginning of the second line. That's the only sort of grammatical or syntactical difference between the 2. Okay. So I've got pretty close identity there. What about on the lexical and semantic level, right? What does it mean? Well, I've got identical words at the beginning, the word not. Then I get two words for bad stuff, sins and iniquities. And actually, this is a good place right now to talk about a phenomenon that we're going to encounter a lot, which is the phenomenon of the word pair. Hebrew poetry, and this is true not just of Hebrew poetry, but also of other poetry from the ancient Near East, including Canaanite poetry, Ugaritic. It's based on these like traditional building blocks because it's in two-line sort of parallel constructions, because it comes in A and B, we end up with like regular traditional pairs of words, such that if you're reading line A and you come across a word, you might even expect to hear the paired word in the B line, right? We're going to see this a lot, so I'm just introducing it now. But this is a good example, right? When you see sins in line A, you might be like, chances are I might see the word iniquities or some other sort of synonym in line B. You know, if you see heavens, you might find earth. If you see Israel, you might find Jacob, so on. So here again, with sins and iniquities, we've got a good word pair. And then we've got verbs, two words for dealing with something or someone, right? To deal with and to requite. And then at the end, two prepositional constructions, both of which are about us, right? To us, for us. I should say, here's a place where your English translation will almost inevitably obscure a difference in the Hebrew, right? If you say in English, dealt with us and requited us, as my English translation does here, it doesn't make clear that in the Hebrew, one preposition, us, and the other one is aleinu, us. It's not that they mean different things, right? Like the meaning is the same, but they're not identical. Okay. Now, again, so semantically, in terms of like what's being said, everything here does look basically identical, although we might say something like iniquities is a tiny bit stronger than plain old sins, generally speaking, in the Bible. And maybe requited is a little bit more specific than dealt with. Certainly in Hebrew, the word dealt with there is like the verb to like make or do. It is like the most generic verb in the entire language. So requited is certainly more specific in the Hebrew. So, you know, for all of what looks like really just this is two lines saying the exact same thing, there are these like subtle ways in which the B line moves past the A line. And if you try to pronounce the Hebrew, you might notice that the B line captures that sense of like a little bit more also on the phonological level. So in Hebrew, right, the first line is lo kachata'enu asalanu, and then the B line is v'lo ka'avonotenu gamal aleinu. So our not lo becomes and not v'lo. Sins, chata'enu, becomes iniquities, avonotenu. Lanu, us, becomes aleinu, us. Which is to say, in 3 out of the 4 words in Hebrew in the B line, there's an extra syllable over against the A line, right? In other words, these two lines again are like in almost every way virtually identical, but the second line, both like in terms of its meaning and in terms of its sound, it like stretches that first one just a tiny bit. Okay, that's a like pretty straightforward example, but even there, there's like these little things that make it fun. Here's another one. First, just the English. He sent Moses, his servant, Aaron, whom he had chosen. Okay, even just in English, you can see a few things going on here. Like if we're comparing the structure of the lines, something from line A is missing in line B, like the verb he sent. Right. Line B, in other words, isn't a full sentence, right? If you only had line B alone, it would just say Aaron, whom he had chosen, and you wouldn't know what the hell you were talking about. But you know, so we end up reading this like as a continuous thought, where the he sent of the A line is understood by the parallel poetic structure, as being present also in the B line. We call this gapping. That is, the he sent is gapped in the B line. But it is very often the case that with gapping also comes like a substitution or a filling out of the second line, right? I remember I suggested that Hebrew doesn't have meter or rhyme, and it doesn't, but it does have rhythm, and it does have like line length. It's not really meter, but right, even in English, right? He sent Moses his servant is 5 words, and Aaron whom he had chosen is 5 words. Even though he sent has been taken out of the first line, and it is missing in the second line. Somehow there's still the same number of words. That's because the poet here has expanded the second line to fill out to compensate for the gapping. So here's the Hebrew you can see. What else can we say about this? I really like this example for a bunch of reasons. So we've got the word order in the 2 lines is not the same, right? He sent, the verb is first, Moses the object, and then a word, that thing, and then another descriptor of Moses, Avdo, his servant. Whereas in the second line, the verb is at the end, whom he had chosen, and Aaron comes first. And we get in the middle, and this is really where the line is expanded, we get the word asher, whom, which I should say while I'm here. Asher, like these little words like asher or like whom, relative pronouns and things like that are really uncommon in poetry. Poetry tends to be rather condensed, rather sort of shorter and crisper. And it's less bound by grammatical rules and syntactical rules. So they often drop a lot of these small words like this, which makes the fact that it's here so much more interesting, because in fact it's there in order, as I suggested, to fill out the line to compensate for the missing he sent in the A line. So word order is sort of not exactly reversed, but the verbs are on the outside, the beginning and the end of the line. He sent and he had chosen. We also get a wonderful bit of alliteration that's happening here, and it crosses over the lines, right? You have to do it in Hebrew. Shalach Moshe, Avdo Aharon Asher. So 3, even in English, you can see 3 ah sounds at the beginning. And then it ends with 2 b sounds, Bachar Bo. So they're playing with sound here. It's alliteration. Also, we've got 2 lines. It's rhyme-y, right? Avdo at the end of one line, Bachar Bo at the end of the second line. So you got what sounds like a little bit of a rhyme there. And what's even better about it in this case is grammatically that's the same thing happening at the end of each line, right? That O is the word for his or him, right? It's a pronoun or a pronominal suffix. So it's the same thing going on. That O is like a him or a his in both cases, but it's a different referent in the 2 lines. So in the first line, Avdo is his, God's servant, and it's in the second line, it's Aaron whom, and that's the bow, whom he had chosen. So it's like God's servant. God is the O of the first line, and Aaron is the O of the second line. Again, so like they're like paralleling the sound, but mixing up syntactically what's happening there. You might also note here, again, I said that obviously the subject here is God. God sent Moses, his servant. It doesn't say God. But where God appears here is in the first word, he sent, and in the last word, whom he had chosen. So along with the verbs on either side, we have God on sort of the beginning and the end of the line, and Moses and Aaron in the middle, and his servant right in the middle. And we could also like, well, what does it mean for Moses to be designated as servant and Aaron is chosen? Again, I'm not going to go into all the things we can do, right? There's only so much we can talk about in this space, but like you can go real deep on these things. I'm going to give you another one. I'm going to give you a bunch of them over the course of the time. This is a super fun one for me. Psalm 34:2. I bless Yahweh at all times. Always praise of him is in my mouth. Okay. The idea of these is obviously like the two lines are saying the same thing. I'm always blessing and praising Yahweh, right? Like that's the big idea here. So the idea, the semantics are the same. Remember, I talked about word pairs, terrific word pairs here. So bless and praise is a pretty standard word pair. You'll notice that that's a word pair, but they're not in the same place in the line. One is the first word, one's the second word. Um, at all times and always, obviously, are like two ways of saying the same thing. And they're also at very different places in the line. One's at the end, one's at the beginning. But what that means, of course, is that you end up saying the two words for always right next to each other. At all times, always. So they're in different places, and yet they're conjoined that way. It's clear in the English also, but the first line here, the A line, I bless Yahweh at all times, is a verbal sentence. Right? It has a verb in it, I bless. The second line is a nominal sentence. Always praise of him is in my mouth, right? There's no like active verb there, just the is, which by the way, is not a Hebrew word, right? There is no Hebrew word for is. So the B line here is just all nouns and adjectives and adverbs and prepositions. So here's a poem or a poet that's like I created this basically identical concept in these two lines, but I've done one with a verb and one without. What else can we say here? I can say a million things about this one. It's so great. I bless at the beginning and in my mouth at the end. Right. So the speaker here is represented on the outsides of the line. And you'll notice, right? Like again, the speaker is represented in line A with the verb I bless. And in the second line, in the B line, represented with in a prepositional phrase, in my mouth. In both lines, Yahweh is in the middle, right? I bless Yahweh at all times, always praise of him, right? That's that O again at the end of Tehilato, right? So Yahweh's in the middle of both lines. The speaker's on the outside of both lines. And the notions of time, as I said, are on the inside, the middle of both lines. And still, the two lines are constructed so that they each end with a prepositional phrase, b, right? At all times in my mouth, which is like a remarkable thing to have accomplished, right? Like I've put, again, speakers on the outside, Yahweh in the middle, time on the inner sides, and yet and one line is verbal, one line is nominal, and yet they still both end syntactically the same way. There's also here. Again, if you're looking at the Hebrew, this is something you could never possibly get in the English. But if you're reading the Hebrew, you might notice that the two lines have this have a little assonance going on. Avaracha et Adonai b'kol et, tamid tehilato b'fi. Right. So the first one is a sound, then b. And the second one is a t sound, then b. And if that's not enough, the two words in line A, the two first words in line A start with Aleph, the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And the two words at the beginning of line B start with Tav, T, the last letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which means this little couplet that is talking about how all the time I'm constantly talking about God has given us like the Hebrew equivalent of, alpha and omega, right? It's by putting the aleph in the first line and the tav in the second line and making those the first two words. It's representing the entirety of time, and time is the thing that is that's in the middle of them. B'kol eight at all times. It's like, I don't know, it's like it's such a simple little line, and yet the construction of this verse is just so complex and so wonderful. Um, you can think of all the ways that we could say these things in just simple, straightforward ways. We wouldn't even have to repeat it. I bless Yahweh at all times. That would get the meaning across, but it's not about the meaning, not exclusively, right? It's clearly about, the artistry of constructing these clever little lines. Okay, here's another one. Many of the same things that we've seen already. O Yahweh, who may sojourn in your tent? Question mark. Of course, there's no question mark in the Hebrew, but there is a question. And who may dwell on the mountain of your holiness? Okay, so same basic idea. If you've been following along, you'd be like, oh, there's some gapping here. It says, "O Yahweh" in the line A, but it says nothing. It doesn't say, "O Yahweh" in line B, even though it's clearly still addressing Yahweh. Okay, so if you remember, right, if there's gapping in line A, if Yahweh is missing in line B has to be extended, right, filled out, compensated to account for that missing rhythm. So where's the compensation here? It's, "O Yahweh, who may sojourn in your tent," and it's just one word, "in your tent." And in the second line, it's, "who may dwell on the mountain of your holiness." Right? Does that make sense? And what's so lovely about it in this case is that Yahweh, the word is gapped that's gapped here. It's in line A, but not in line B. The word that they have used to extend line B to compensate is "your holiness," which is to say they've put Yahweh back in the verse with the reference to his holiness, which I realize sounds like a reference to the Pope, a reference to God's holiness. So Yahweh is now is still there, just not by name, now by sort of characteristic. What else do we see here? We see in the verbs, "who may sojourn," "who may dwell." There's a progression there, right? Sojourning is a temporary sort of thing, right? The Yagor, this is the same word that gives us the noun ger, which we translate in English usually as a stranger, right? An immigrant. So it's a not temporary, it is a non-permanent kind of visiting. So who may sojourn, and then who may dwell, and dwell is really like to live somewhere permanently. So we have the progression there. We also have, that's also a word pair, right? Sojourn and dwell are both words for sort of staying someplace. So I've got a progression there, and I've got an expansion from the tent, right? Like one very specific locale to a mountain. So, again, progression on one level, expansion from a tent to a mountain on the other. All these things are happening at once. And if we really slow down and think about all of them, we end up with this, like, a much fuller, again, this is a line that if you just went over it quickly, you'd be like, "Who may sojourn in your tent, who may dwell in the mountain of your holiness?" Yep, I got it, right? Like, I understand I understand the gist of the thing, but the poetry is not is in much more than just the gist. Here's one that's, I think, a little bit more interesting. Definitely more interesting. Psalm 104. He made the moon. This is obviously God. He made the moon for set times. Moadim there. That word is like, that's the word that's used for like the timing of holidays, right? And you can understand. I'm going to interrupt my reading for a second. Like the Moadim again, like that's like in Genesis 1 where it says he puts up the moon and the stars. They are for the set times, the Moadim. That's, again, remember, Israel's working on a mostly lunar calendar, and certainly the festivals are all lunar based. So that's like, those are the set times. So he made the moon for set times. The sun knows its setting. Those of you who know Hebrew will be like, that word, that last word, setting, is that mavo'o or mabo'o, means it's like it's entering. And that's because in biblical mindset, right, when the sun comes up, it's exiting its home. and it goes across the sky, and then it re-enters its home on the other side of the world. When the sun sets, they say it's entering. So that's what's going on here. He made the moon for set times. The sun knows it's setting. This is a funny one because, again, grammatically, they're actually identical. Two verbs, two nouns, two prepositional phrases. But syntactically, these lines are actually really different. The order is obviously very different, and the subject and the moon and the sun in the moon is the object of the A line, where the sun is the subject of the B line. So again, like it's these little things are really difficult to see and easy to gloss over. Obviously, there's a word pair here, sun and moon, but again, one of them is the object, one of them is the subject. This is a fun one to say out loud in Hebrew. Asa yareach lemoadim, shemesh yada mevo'o. There's a phonological thing going on here, right? You've got at the end of the lines, you've got the M sounds and the O sounds, lemoadim, mevo'o. In the middle, you've got these ya sounds, yareach, yada. You also have, and this is actually very difficult unless you like know Hebrew relatively well, but yada and mo'adim are mostly the same letters, just jumbled around a little bit. So there's this phonological play going on. Like the semantics, what it means, like relatively different compared to what we've seen before. Everything we've seen before, the two lines have basically meant the same thing. Here, like not really, right? Like God made the moon for these set times. The sun knows its setting. One is about the moon and one about the sun. And certainly it's, the notion of what's being said here is, right, like time is regular. But in one hand, it's because God made it so. And in the other one is because the sun does its own thing, right? Like, and so there's this interesting differentiated notion of how the heavenly bodies know what to do or do what they do. Again, the fact that the A line and B line are so different here doesn't mean it's not parallel, right? They're always parallel, right? Parallelism, again, doesn't mean the same, right? It's about the relationship between the two lines. How do we read them with and or against or even into each other? And again, like what I was just talking about this, it's really only when you sort of start thinking about the parallelism, right? How do these two lines relate to each other that you end up thinking things like, oh, that's weird. Like the moon seems to do what it does because God said it to do that, but the sun seems to be working on its own, right? Like you get that, or at least you get it more sharply by really trying to interrogate like what's going on here. Why is one, moon is object and sun is subject. That's interesting. Okay, here is at least one more. I have some extras just in case I ran out of time, but I seem to be doing okay. This one's not from Psalms, but I really like what's happening here. This is from Isaiah. And I will apologize in advance for what is a really stilted translation, but I really wanted to capture the Hebrew here. Right, you would never translate this line into "Broken is the town of emptiness, closed is every house from entrance." It's like terrible English poetry. But it is the words in that order in Hebrew. So again, here we have some word pairs, town and house, right? That's fine. That's pretty straightforward and easy. That's a normal kind of pairing of things. This is a place where it's not apparent in the English because we have the first two words are broken and closed, which in English are grammatically identical. But in Hebrew, these are two different passive conjugations of verbs. The first one relatively common, and the second one relatively uncommon. So they're using, right, in English it's just two passive participles. In Hebrew, they're both active. No, they're actively passive verbs, but of two different varieties. What do we have? We have a town in the first line, and then we have every house in the second. So one town and then multiple houses. So there's like a multiplication there, but also, of course, a narrowing, right? From the whole town to like now we're focusing on the individual houses. And what's happening in both is not the same. Broken and empty is generically what the town is going through, whereas sort of closed and shut is what the houses are doing. And I will tell you, this is one of my favorite little poetic things for a reason that is unimaginable. You couldn't possibly see it in the English, which is why I like it so much. The last word of the A line is the word tohu, which even most English speakers know the biblical phrase tohu vavohu, right? I think this is like become I think tohu vohu is like I think it's like in modern French still. It's the word from Genesis 1 for chaos. Right. In the very beginning, God creates the earth, and the earth was like dark and void, or like chaotic, and whatever it is. Tohu vavohu is the Hebrew there. And 90+% of the time, those words exist only with each other, right? It's like a fixed phrase, tohu vavohu. It's right, like it's messy and mussy. I don't have a good English equivalent of it. But here we have just the word tohu, which when you hear it in the Hebrew, nishbara kiryat tohu, you're like, I know it's coming in the second line. Sagur kol bayit mibo. And it knows that tohu wants bohu to come after it, but it cuts the word off. So like it alludes to the phrase tohu vavohu, but it leaves you like wanting for the second half of the word. Which, if we were going to really like read in this very deep, like, or very, I don't know, cutesy or very, however you want to put it, like you might say that the cutting off of that word is actually like doing a thing. It's representing, like it's capturing the sense of the verse, which is everything's broken, right? The first word is broken, and the last word, bohu, is broken, right? It's closed. It didn't make it. And for a line that is describing, obviously, destruction of a town, I just think that it's this spectacularly clever little thing there. I'm going to do one more to decide which one I want to do. I'm going to do this next one. I'll do this one, and then I'll go to questions because I'm conscious of time. But like I could do this forever. So we're back into the Psalms, Psalm 97. For you, O Yahweh, are supreme over all the earth. Greatly are you exalted over all gods. This is a funny one because there's definitely gapping, but there's not a ton of compensating expansion. In Hebrew, Ki ata Adonai elyon al kol haaretz, ma'od na'aleta al kol Elohim. I guess they're pretty close to each other. What can we say about this? The first line has you, like a pronoun, like the independent pronoun you, which again, relatively rare in poetry. These are these kinds of words that we don't see very often. You, O Yahweh, right? All of which is gone in line 2. In the B line, all of that, the you and the Yahweh, are represented only by the ta at the end of na'alet ta. So we've gone from this very lengthy way of sort of addressing God to a very small reference to him in the second line. Elyon, right, is actually, I'm translated here as supreme. It really means like most high. When you see things like God most high in your Bible translations, that's as a title, that's like Elyon. So here they've taken a common name or title for God and turned it into its adjectival form. Obviously, over all the earth, al kol haaretz, and over all gods, al kol Elohim. You've got that very parallel thing going on. What's interesting is you expect, I said this earlier, right? You expect earth to be paired with heavens or some other word for earth. But here, you're supreme over all the earth. Greatly are you exalted over all the, I might expect world, I might expect heavens. Instead, I have gods. Which is like should be a moment of like we're taken aback by that. I didn't expect it to be to gods there. Um, like four of the words in here are all built on the exact same basic root, right? Which is ayin lamed, al, above, upon, or Allah, go up. So elyon, al kol haaretz, not aleta, al kol Elohim, right? The language is repetitive and it's assonant and it's like it's sort of it's emphasizing the lifting. And almost the only words that aren't about being raised up like that are you, O Yahweh, and very, right? Greatly at the beginning of line two. And that ma'od, that greatly sort of like pops right out because it's the one word in the middle of all of the like rising above al words. Um, I'm sure there's like so much more that I could say about this, and I'm not gonna because I want to respect everyone's time and I want to be able to answer questions. Um, let me before I do that, let me just make sure that there are questions because if there aren't, then I can keep going. Um, uh, there's a few questions. Um, Terrific. I'm going to go to questions and know that I could do this all day long, and that in the next 2 weeks, as we start looking at actual Psalms, we are going to do that. Let me just sort of finish with a couple of words, which are like, uh, you know, again, like I hope it's apparent that I love this stuff. I find this sort of magic of really being able to dig into and explore the art. This is the mechanics of biblical poetry. This is like the building blocks. It's the inner workings of the thing. This is where we see, again, not just meaning, but also artistry, right? It's complexity and variety and playfulness. Uh, and I think it's a helpful reminder when we're reading biblical texts generally, but biblical poetry especially, it's not we're not always just trying to figure out what like the meaning is or what the deep truth underneath it is or like what the message of the thing is. Right? If that were the case, we could rewrite all of these poems as prose or as one line or just like more simply, and they would mean the same thing. But really reading biblical poetry, especially the Psalms, it's about beauty. It's about sort of art for the sake of art. Yes, this is scripture, but it's literature, it's poetry, um, and so like appreciating not just what it says, but how it says it. I think is really more than half the battle when we're reading this stuff. Like I said, next time we're going to put it all together and we'll start reading entire Psalms and we'll see both these inner structures in each two-line couplet and then larger ones as these work across entire poems. I'm looking forward to it. Let me get to some questions here. It says on the page in front of me, when I was a kid, and without knowing the age of the person who wrote this, that could be anywhere from a few years ago to the 1930s. When I was a kid, parallelism was used to help explain away doublets that happen in the narratives. Anything is that worth noting? And that's a really I love that as an explanation because it's certainly true. The fact that Hebrew poetry works this way, you get one line, then you get it again slightly different, may for some people sort of informs the way that they think about, well, I got one creation story, then I got a slightly different creation story in the next chapter. I think no. I think that's probably sort of wishful thinking in a certain sense. But I also think there are places you get stuff like this, like things that are back to back that don't agree with each other. And I will say, for all the fact that I really do believe that we've got like multiple authors represented in these different narratives. That I think that they're in ancient Israel. It seems likely to me that they were more tolerant of variation in their texts than we are. I still think there are sources in the Pentateuch and elsewhere, but I do think that they were probably more tolerant as readers than we are. Um, uh, a similar, well, not similar, but certainly still thinking about composition. Is there any way to know that the A and B lines that appear in parallelism come from different compositions? And the answer is for sure they don't. Um, uh, the A and B lines are, again, these are like the integral, like it is the relationship between the two things that makes up poetry. If somebody gave me an A line, I could probably write a B line, but they would be doing it anyway because there are, with a very few exceptions, there is no poetry in the Bible that isn't in this two-line format. And it's not just in the Bible. It's also in ancient poetry from like way before the Bible in Ugarit in so ancient in Canaan. Their poetry was constructed this way too. So it's like this is the native like sort of local way of doing this. Um, okay. Do the parallelisms of Hebrew poetry aid in memorization the same way that meter and rhyme do in other languages? Super interesting question. I mean, I think the answer has to be yes. And at the same time, yeah, I mean, you remember that like in previous sessions, I talked about the fact that there's like all of this um, sort of generic language, right? Like the language you find in one psalm could easily be swapped with another psalm from the same genre. So Psalms 3 and 54 are the two that I've been putting in front of you regularly. Um, and so what I would say is it's not that it may be the fact that parallelism helps aid in memorization. Like when you hear the A line, you generate the B line. But I think it's actually probably more the case that parallelism aids in the construction of new poetry. That is, like, I come up with an A line, and I know because I'm supposed to be doing a parallelistic construction that my B line is going to say something slightly different. And I know that if I use and also the stuff I talked about word pairs, um, word pairs are like that too. If you've ever studied like classics, which I will admit that I really haven't. But I know things like, when you're reading like the Iliad, uh, when Homer describes the ocean or the Mediterranean, right? It's always like it's like the wine dark sea, right? Over and over and over again. And the idea behind that, I think, is not dissimilar from the idea behind sort of the way that biblical poetry is constructed with word pairs, which is to say, like that's in Homer, right? The wine dark sea is repeated as the descriptor for the sea because it's like that's just the words that we use, right? Once I start to say sea, in order for me to like to get the rhythm right, right, we add this expression to it. In biblical poetry, um, word pairs are both help with memorization and help with generating new poetry. And they help listeners know what to expect, which is also a big thing. Um, a couple of questions about the Psalms as oral versus written, or biblical poetry as oral versus written, right? So one question was, do scholars speculate that the Psalms were originally written or oral? And another question related is, these complex grammatical parallelisms seem to point to written rather than oral composition. And again, I actually think it's a yes and in this case, which say I don't want to fall back on sort of the trope of like, well, before prose, everybody just spoke poetry, right? Which is like not the way it is, even though so much of the time we think, oh yes, well, poetry is earlier and prose is later. And in part that's because of things like Homer, right? Or we're like, oh, what's the oldest stuff out there? It's poetry. And even in the Bible, often we get the sense that like poetry is older. But it's not, right? Like people were obviously speaking in prose and probably writing in prose at the same time as they were doing poetry. So were the Psalms originally written or oral? Is parallelism written or oral? I think it's both, right? As I was sort of just saying with the Homer thing, right? Like the regular repetition of expressions, I think is generally understood to be a feature of oral composition, right? Like the speaker goes back to like these traditional phrases. And that I think is what's happening a lot of the time in the poetry too, where, as I said, like, you know, you say like the the earth is the Lord's and all that is in it. And then I'm like, okay, so the next line is going to be have the world and all its inhabitants or whatever. Um, uh, you know, so the the word pairs, the parallelism, I think aid in oral construction, and then at a certain point, or alongside again, uh, people who are then producing this not as spoken, but as like literature, then are able to manipulate it in all of these very like thoughtful ways. Again, I don't want to say like the people who are like oral poets were any less creative. And we also, you know, we don't want to fall into the trap of being like, oh, the oral composition is always spontaneous, right? They're just on the spur of the moment being like, I'm going to say a poem, which we know is not how oral composition works. You know, like Homer, right? These are things that were recited over and over again and tweaked and finessed, and different speakers added things, and they became. Uh, so, I mean, I love the question about oral versus written, in part because it allows us to remember that these two things aren't separate. They're really very much interwoven. Um, uh, for those of us, I'm going to end here with this practical question, which is for those of us with zero knowledge of Hebrew, what's the best way to understand and appreciate the poetry within Psalms? Is there a translation that can help us? And I will say, I don't know. And in part, that's because I've never needed to look for one. Um, you know, part of me thinks someone out there must have done a good sort of attempt at capturing some of this, but it would have to be a real, you know, you can't get it. Like there's just things you can't possibly capture in Hebrew. The sound of the thing is, you know, you could capture maybe a little bit of the echoes, but uh, but impossible, I think, to capture the whole range. And I think that we should sort of recognize that that's a universal aspect of translation. Uh, there's always enormous loss. And I just happen to think that here there's like extra enormous loss just because, you know, their the word order in Hebrew is really malleable in poetry, not in prose, but in poetry, you know, you can sort of do things in almost any order. Um, and in English, we can't. Otherwise, it ends up looking crazy, like that one that I Isaiah one or whichever it was that I put up when I was like, I apologize for this translation. Um, I will think about that. I will ask some people. Um, I have a friend who is a translator, and I will ask her whether she knows of anything, and if not, she should do it. Um, but you know, the best thing to do here, okay. Now I have an answer because I was thinking like, oh, you know, is there a translation or a book out there that does this? And that the answer might be no. The best way to understand and appreciate the poetry within Psalms is to find someone who knows Hebrew and read with them. Uh, and I bet you can find one somewhere.